The next speaker is Mr. Juan Rau Ferreira, President of Uruguay-Israel Cultural Institute and President of the National Human Rights Institutions of Uruguay. He served as a member of Congress and Senate of Uruguay and represented Uruguay at the United Nations, the Organizations of American States, and the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade. He has also worked with several non-governmental organizations as a human rights advocate. Thanks for being here. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Perdón. Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much, Chairman.
Muchas gracias, señor embajador del Estado de Palestina.
I thank the ambassador of the State of Palestine in Brazil. Thank you, Rafael, for bringing us the letter from Salomon. We were so very concerned that for reasons of force majeure, at the last minute he was not able to come. And thank you so much also to Mr. Arias for his wonderful presentation. I will be speaking within my 15-minute time period, although I can't see my watch very well. I should like to thank the presence of the Chargé d'Affaires and the representative of Uruguay, the interim representative in Ecuador, Juan Motora. He has honored us with his presence representing Uruguay. And the representative of the Palestinian state. And I cannot fail to also, he's going to get mad at me as he always does whenever there are meetings like this, but I have to spend a specially warm greeting to Mr. Kaufman. He introduced me, or brought me into this effort with a very clear focus on human rights. He was able to channel or focus some of my skills and talents in this direction, focusing on peace and fraternity, really, with these two states in the Middle East. But I should add something else, and this is what's going to make him mad. But he always gets mad, so don't worry about this. I should add also that all Latin Americans, and many that aren't Latin Americans, know what it was for Latin America to see the Condor Plan. Dr. Kaufman, in his universal focus on human rights, had a year-long sabbatical in Amnesty International when my family was, and I as well, was about to lose our lives. And in an effort that is worthy of the biggest epics, he moved heaven and earth in order to save our lives. I would not be here 40 years later if Dr. Kaufman had not intervened when he did to save my father's life and my life. I am morally, eternally indebted to say so. Since I was young, I was told that you should never begin a conference or a speech by asking forgiveness. However, I'm going to violate that golden rule that I learned when I was a child in order to apologize to you for having interrupted the meeting. Adriana Amilia, who was answering a question, and I should have been present with Dr. Kaufman, but I say this really to express my appreciation for the enormous human sensitivity from the United Nations personnel when it comes to having help with this problem that was caused by the altitude. This country has always been a country that's welcomed us. However, next time let's do this at sea level.
Hace un par de años, este comité.
Some years ago, this conference was met in Montevideo, and at that time I also had the opportunity to be invited to offer brief remarks.
And I'd just like to point out two things in this meeting that I think it's important to highlight in my presentation, and that is that when I was talking earlier, I referred to an old Uruguayan tradition, which can be added to the Latin American tradition, which is part of the Committee on the Palestinian Question from 1948. Sorry. Thank you for the correction. Ambassador Ferreira had started the Committee on the Two-State Solution, that's for the region. But moreover, Uruguay always had a strong vocation in the United Nations. Twice it was president in the Security Council, and apparently it has a possibility of going back to the National Security Council. Now you have to wonder why a small country in terms of its people, the size of its country geographically and so forth, economically, why would it play such a disproportionate role on the international stage given its weight as a country? And in a moment I'll address that. But going back to that meeting that we had in Montevideo, I remember the words I used at the time. I said that Uruguay had a great vocation as a country which export peace and tolerance to the Middle East. We have a significant Jewish community in our country that lives harmoniously, side by side, based on constructive initiatives with a large Palestinian community. And I have the huge honor of belonging on behalf of Uruguay to a committee made up of 3 members. I came with a great Jewish activist, someone who's working for peace actively, and perhaps the most representative, well-known person for the Palestinian community of my country, from the area where most of the Palestinians live in Uruguay. And since that first meeting in Montevideo, where we started visiting each other, where we started talking to each other, and then the area where the Palestinians live is quite far, and it's hard to get there sometimes, but we got to their home, and they opened their doors wide. All the doors of the Palestinian community were open wide to us. Then we met with the representatives of the Jewish community, and we started to see that when Mr. Aria was talking about the peace movement, now I heard him say, and he could say it quite well, the Palestinians. We find ourselves before an effort that we had not seen perhaps with so much vigor, and that is that each person was attempting to put themselves in the shoes of the other person. They weren't just expressing their own feelings and talking about their loved ones. They were really trying to see how they would look at the problem if they weren't in their own shoes, but if they were in the shoes of the person across. And that led to marvelous results. Sometimes, for Lionel and me, we were brought to tears almost by meetings. Sometimes it started with a certain amount of tension, and in the end, people were hugging each other in a brotherly manner and saying, Habibi, friend. It's a Hebrew and Arab word that we have in common, which says so much, coming from 2 cousin peoples, as we say, both descendants of Abraham. The difference between that time and now, let's look at that. And if I may, I'd just like to get a little personal here. In my parliament, just a little bit after the event, I had the great honor of being designated Ombudsman for the People and President of the National Human Rights Institution. And I make this reference to say I'm not coming here representing any specific institution per se, but I do want to put it on the table. What I'm putting on the table is the will and determination of all the NGOs, the human rights institutions, state institutions such as ours, governmental. In Uruguay, we have the distinction there between bodies that are controlled by the government or regulated by the government, others that are part and parcel of the government. Anyway, all of these institutions are working together to do everything they can to promote the friendship of these two peoples that we Uruguayans like so much, and the authorities in our country also recognize both. The other thing that happened since that time, since that conference, was that at the end of that conference, that very same night, Uruguay signed papers that formalized its recognition of the Palestinian state. I don't know if this has happened in many other countries, but I think it's interesting testimony to share with you that on the night where in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs they signed those papers recognizing Palestine, there were national authorities present, parliamentarians, and Palestinian or Uruguayans and Jewish Uruguayans were all present. I don't know, and I repeat this, I don't know if that's happened anywhere else in the world. Let's say the truth and nothing but the truth. Formal institutions which represent the different communities as such were not present, but there were important elements of both communities that showed that the desire of Uruguay, the determination of Uruguay to recognize the Palestinian state was not controversial. On the contrary, it was something that enjoyed a consensus for all Uruguayans. And there was nothing to hinder that support. The third thing that happened since that conference in Montevideo, which I'd like to highlight, is that the efforts made by my compatriots, Israelis, Palestinians, and what will be described today, what was created was what we call the Montevideo Consensus. It's a sort of a self-convened means of seeking peace, coming together to talk about it and seek peace. It was a consensus based on that. The Minister of Foreign Affairs, and I think it would be perhaps imprudent to mention this, but did not grant them specific official support. And we could even think about new activities henceforth, not just as compatriots in Uruguay, but as Palestinian and Israeli compatriots, but also with compatriots of our compatriots, Palestinians, Jews, from all over Latin America and all parts of Uruguay. It was almost an invitation that was extended, almost an invitation. Now it's up to you to continue that. The fifth element, and I'm coming to the end here, the fifth issue I'd like to describe. Uruguay has taken on a role in the concert of nations in terms of the international role that it had lost. And this is new now. Uruguay is in the international headlines, both with regard to its domestic legislation to make progress in the area of human rights, but also in the area of initiatives and cooperation, and imposition in order to cooperate and work towards peace together. And finally, something I'd like to point out that's happened since the last meeting we had in Montevideo, what's happened between then and now, is that in the world, civil society is playing a very different role, a much more visible and active role. In the last couple of years, civil society has broken out as a major player on the international stage. And I think that's important. As the United Nations is doing in this forum today, other institutions, other multilateral institutions, are noting that civil society has decided to participate in the process. Democratization, peace, living together peacefully. And if international bodies and institutions are involved in negotiating, and while if international entities or bodies are not giving civil society the room that they're clamoring for, they will just break in. Sometimes it's inefficient and leads to situations of violence, which we end up all regretting. Before making just a couple of recommendations, I'd like to say that as a part of this new reality that Uruguay is experiencing, for the last 4 years, Uruguay has been part of the Universal Periodic Review of the United Nations. Its first meeting was held 4 years ago, and at that review, one of the recommendations issued was the creation of a national human rights institution, which I preside over today. And the last meeting that was held in April in Geneva, meeting of the UPR, Uruguay went with 2 representatives, the government and another seat, so 1 seat for the government oversight. As you know, they don't have a vote, but they have a voice, not just in the area of domestic issues represented in the national institutions according to the Paris principles, also with the power to make recommendations to other states in the area of human rights and adherence to international law. So at this meeting in January in Geneva, very interesting circumstances arose, and I think it's an eloquent illustration of what I'm trying to say. Uruguay is a small country. Uruguay, and my generation for a long time in Uruguay, would go to international organizations, United Nations, etc., in order to be on the seat of the accused, have the finger pointed at us as a country that violated human rights and promoted terrorism. And today, almost magically, we are sitting on the throne of a model country in the area of human rights. And I say this with pride for Uruguay. The foreign minister of Uruguay, the secretary of the presidency, and other high-level officials. When this was put on the table, they said, okay, we're not going to accept this from the international community. We're not a model country. We are a country that created the legal framework and structure in order to combat injustice, to combat poverty, to combat marginalization, and to be able to walk through the doors to peaceful settlement of disputes and adherence to international law. But we're not a model country. We have put in place mechanisms after 30 years of democracy which allow us to fight, to have the tools available to us, to be able to work towards the utopia of a model country. I say that as a Uruguayan that was so often sitting on the bench of the accused, with the finger pointed at us due to the genocidal regime that ruled for so long. And now I have the pride of a simple Republican in Uruguay saying, let's not get confused. We've created some instruments, and let's use them, and then you can judge us after that.
El Uruguay aceptó de
186 recommendations were made. It's a small country like ours, from different member states, and we accepted 185 of those recommendations at the UPR. They fit with the Uruguayan concept of human rights, and they fit in with our legal framework. In other words, Uruguay came back to the UPR after 4 years with the 105 recommendations of member states of the United Nations that it had implemented. Of those 185 UPR Universal Periodic Review recommendations. 77 recommendations encouraged Uruguay to integrate more and more into the international community to offer its good services, to achieve the objective of peace. That's what Uruguay was requested by the United Nations at the Universal Periodic Review on Human Rights. And I say that with great humility, but also very frankly. I want that to stay in all of your minds. Uruguay is a country that is here to serve in order to continue advancing in the Middle East peace process, like everywhere else in the world where peace is a distant goal. And I conclude my remarks by remembering something that happened which moved me a great deal with the words of the President of the current President of the Republic, President Cordano. And many of you will know he was involved in the guerrillas in the 1970s. He was a prisoner for 20 years. He led the very well-known and famous Tupamaro terrorist movement, and now he is at the helm of a democratic country based on the people's vote, putting him in office. And one day he received a tribute from the Jewish community in Uruguay. And he didn't hesitate to accept it. And I, if I may be so bold, without any papers here, I would like to, from my memory, repeat not how his words ended, because it was very brief. I'm going to tell you from memory what his words were. He said, mankind throughout its history has been characterized by two efforts: the effort to find God and the effort to invent weapons to kill himself. As to finding God, and I'm repeating word for word, I'm going quickly because I don't have so much time as I'm aging, as you might know. With regard to weapons, I, as a child, he said, I had a pistol at my waist, and I have to tell you that is not the path, believe me. And I'm here to tell you, before all of you, and I'm still quoting him, that everything that I say before a Jewish community, those words, everything I'm saying would be the same words that I would say with dignity and holding my head high in a mosque. And I highlight that message, which was so brief and so profound, from the President, President Mujica. Even though I am not representing the government, the body which I run is an independent organization. But I just want to leave this with you. Uruguay is working for peace in the Middle East and is here to serve the international community to make the contribution that it can. And I just want to say, don't forget us in the regional organizations. We must all work with them and ask for their participation. UNASUR is an organization made up of countries that are committed to friendship with both peoples. We demand that UNASUR play a unifying role in terms of the foreign policies of the whole region, with a view to working towards negotiated peace and living together in harmony. That is, harmony between our compatriots and the compatriots of our compatriots. Thank you, Jews and Arabs.
I thank Mr. Ferreira for his insightful presentation. The committee values the support of the Uruguay government and civil society for the cause of Palestine. We felt and observed the feeling that was shared by Ambassador during our visit of Montevideo, the conference on Palestine. and we add our voice in understanding the importance of this coexistence between the Palestinian and Jewish community in your country. Thank you very much for your presentation.